Good evening. I'm Nestor Davidson, chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting of the board. This is the fifth meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City with leases commencing on or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2024, and on or before September 30th, 2025. I will now take a roll call. Please respond if present. Doug Apple?
Present.
Genesis Aquino. Take and roll.
Called your name. Present.
Present.
Christina DeRose.
Present.
Robert Ehrlich.
Present.
Arpit Gupta.
Present.
Alex Schwartz.
Present.
Christina Smith.
Present.
Adon Soltren.
Present.
And Nestor Davidson, I am present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. The proposed rental adjustments voted at this meeting will be published in the city record and posted to our website, nyc.gov/RGB, and through the NYC Rules website at http://rules.cityofnewyork.us. 4 public hearings to comment on the proposed guidelines will be held on the following dates and times. On May 30th, we will have an in-person hearing at the Jamaica Performing Arts Center, 15301 Jamaica Avenue in Queens, from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. On June 3rd, at Hustos College, 450 Grand Concourse in the Bronx, from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. June 11th, in person at Adler Hall, New York Society for Ethical Culture, 2 West 64th Street, New York, New York, again from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. And the board will hold a public hearing in Brooklyn. The venue and date will be announced in coming days. Anyone who wants to comment on the proposed rule at a public hearing must sign up to speak. People wishing to speak at the public hearings can pre-register in advance. Pre-registration of speakers will begin May 15th at 9 a.m. and is advised. You can pre-register online through our website, again that's nyc.gov/RGB, or you can sign up to speak by calling at 212-669-7480 from 9 a.m. until 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. For those who do not pre-register, registration is also available at the in-person public hearings from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. All public hearings will be live streamed and will include Spanish interpretation. You can also submit written, audio, and video comments for board members' review starting on May 6th and continuing through June 11th. Instructions to submit these comments will be available on the board's website at nyc.gov/RGB, by email at ask@rgb.nyc.gov, or by calling in the RGB, again, 212-669-7480. Our next meeting will be May 23rd at the Landmarks Preservation Commission Conference Room, 1 Center Street, 9th floor in Lower Manhattan, starting at 9:30 a.m. Information about this meeting is on our website, nyc.gov/RGB, in our meeting section. If you are interested in receiving email updates about upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please go to our homepage and click on Email Updates under Quick Links. You may also call the board at 212-669-7480 or email the staff at ask@rgb.nyc.gov for information on how to attend future meetings. The final vote on our guidelines will take place on June 17th, starting at 7 p.m. in the Assembly Hall at Hunter College, East 69th Street between Park and Lexington Avenue, New York, New York, 10065. And if you're planning to join us on the 17th, I encourage you to arrive early. Now, we will first hear motions on our Hotel Order 54. It is my understanding that the tenant and the owner reps do not wish to move a hotel order. All right. At this time, then, I would like to put forward a motion for proposed rental adjustments for rent-stabilized hotel units. I move to adopt the language of proposed Hotel Order 54, number 54, and I move to adopt the following proposed rental adjustments for rent-stabilized hotels. 1, residential Class A apartment hotels, 0%. 2, lodging houses, 0%. 3, rooming houses, Class B buildings containing fewer than 30 units, 0%. 4, Class B hotels, 0%. And 5, single-room occupancy buildings, MDL Section 248, SROs, 0%. To summarize, in accordance with my motion, you are voting on the adjustments I proposed and the proposed language of the order. Is there any discussion?
Yes.
Do I have a second? I have a second. All right, I will now take a roll call on the hotel order. Doug Apple.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Nestor.
Yes.
Normally, isn't there a period of comments prior
Yes,
to
I'm
the
sorry.
vote?
I had asked if you had comments, please.
I'm sorry, I couldn't
That's
hear you.
okay. Any comments, please, on the hotel order?
Now it's time for comments, if you could go ahead.
Comments on the increases, right?
Yeah.
I didn't hear anything.
It's comments on you voting on the hotel. Just give your comments generally.
Okay. So, of course, I support a rollback and a zero increase for the hotels and the SROs, just like I would for apartments. And whether my vote counts as a tenant rep, I doubt. And if you ask me if the voices of the New York City tenants matter in this process, I will say no. I think, therefore, it is this board, the votes, the process is a sham. And when people show up, I say that because I learned that people just show up this year with their mind already made that they are going to vote on the same increases as last year. Besides knowing that the real estate got everything they wanted in the budget, in the state budget, and that there has not been any remedy for tenants, right? Any increases today, it will be putting the gallops on tenants' neck. And because my vote, any vote that I propose that is fair or just like a rollback or a zero increase, would not even be considered today or during this whole season. I know that tenants' voices and our voices here don't matter. I cannot vote on anything that would continue strangling working class tenants. To the point of displacement. So it is time to decommodify housing and get rollbacks on SROs and apartments.
Good evening. I wish I could tell you that my comments are going to be brief, but there's a lot I have to say, so here it goes. I wish I could tell you all this year that this administration and the board would understand the current affordability crisis, that they would understand the data and the picture it paints about the struggles of tenants, and that they would understand the inherent imbalance of power in this process. I wish I could tell you that they would roll back rents or freeze rents, or even adjust them minimally, but unfortunately, none of those things have happened, nor will they happen tonight or at the final vote on June 17th. During the middle of the global pandemic, and as soon as the current administration came into power, the Rent Guidelines Board composition changed, and we started seeing the highest rent increases in nearly a decade. In 2022, 3.25 on a 1 year. In 2023, 3% on a 1 year. Now, spoiler alert, they want to increase your rent to something similar as last year. While I can't say for certain, it's likely the preliminary vote range will be somewhere close to the 2 to 5% increase on a 1 year and a 4 to 7 on a 2 year. What the board and this administration has done and continues to do is not only unacceptable, it is unconscionable. To be clear, for those wondering what happened last year, Hennessis and I voted for an upward rental adjustment out of what we deemed necessary to prevent higher rents and more harm to tenants. We did so off of the information we had at the time, and we know that the administration touted this as collaboration, but rest assured, it was not. While I will always keep open ears and an open door, seeing the way all five public members seem to be in agreement about raising your rents an additional 2 to 5% this year, barring a change in drastic course, there will be no compromise, forced or otherwise, this year. I've been at this for 3 years now, and each year the board has made the decision to further harm tenants by increasing their rent significantly through the data the board has relied on, though the board has relied on is different each year. It's truly remarkable that in the history of the RGB, no matter the data, no matter the circumstance, the overwhelming majority of years in its existence, the result is the same. NOI is down, rent increase. NOI is up, rent increase. PIOC is down, rent increase. PIOC is up, rent increase. Insurance costs are low, increase. Insurance costs are high, rent increase. Vacancies are up, rent increase. Vacancies are at 1.4%, the lowest vacancy rate in modern history. And you guessed it, here comes another rent increase. You wonder why some people call it the Rent Increase Board. I've mentioned my frustration in years past. I've mentioned my frustration in years past about how I felt the goalposts kept moving during negotiations. Members would seem interested in different affordability data or new ways to look at different issues, but when it's all said and done, regardless of the validity of our positions and the data regarding those tenant struggles, there was always an additional justification they would manufacture on the back end to do what everyone has come to expect from this board 90% of the time: raise your rents. What I learned early on, and is even more clear now, is that this really isn't about goalposts. It isn't about new data to try and track down, to decipher, to prove to you that people are struggling. It's really not even about the data at all in some ways. The data on affordability is ultimately unpersuasive to them because they philosophically and fundamentally do not believe that it is their job as members of this board to protect rent-stabilized tenants. They instead focus on preserving the stability and profits of businesses and adopt the owner's argument that the only way to ensure that the quality of the actual housing stock is preserved through rent increases put on you. Not only is this argument false and it's been refuted, but framing the issue as one of degrees of suffering between a business and owners who have negative consequences from business decisions and tenants suffering is abhorrent. They are not, nor will they ever be equal, and the practice of treating the two as though they are is morally indefensible. For this board and this administration, it is unpersuasive for them to hear that rents in New York City went up 965% since 1968. It's unpersuasive to hear about how real wages have gone down for tenants another 6%, a second year back-to-back drop. It's unpersuasive for them to hear about how 50% of all New Yorkers are either in poverty or low income. It's unpersuasive to hear that 600,000 units with rents below $1,500 have been lost since 1993, while the 75,000 they've added are charged at $5,000 or more. They don't care to hear about the median household income of rent-stabilized tenants going down. They don't care that landlords recouped $1 billion in MCI since 2019, or how they got $2.8 billion from ERAP, or how the rollbacks to the HSTPA have reinstated permanent IAIs 2 weeks ago at the legislative level. They don't care about the 21% of rent-stabilized tenants that are food insecure. They don't care to hear that 13% of all households are behind on their rent, and they don't care that 58% of eviction cases are in rent-regulated housing, and that number is actually higher because they're only counting partial evictions. They're not counting the number of people that leave their apartment and have to surrender it or get intimidated and leave. That's not in that calculation. They don't care to hear that homeless shelter placements are up 54% in the last year. And although they talk about the migrant crisis, only 9.5% of that number is due to the migrant crisis. It was going up before. It doesn't matter if some of you board members don't maliciously intend to harm 3 million people. It doesn't matter if you think that by including more affordability data or by actually listening to tenants at 5 or 6 public hearings or telling other board members in public that you care about tenants, if your actions year in and year out say the opposite. And let's be clear, your actions, this board and this administration, your actions are contributing to more homelessness, more evictions, more gentrification, more food insecurity, and the destabilizing and destruction of low-income households and households of color. It doesn't matter if you're just the Rent Guidelines Board. It doesn't matter if we can agree that the board's power is limited and that we are equipped with limited blunt tools that can't solve the much larger issue of systemic racism, classism, and poverty. There are plenty of other systems, politicians, and agencies and individuals that are responsible for the injustices that plague tenants. That does not absolve you of the responsibility to limit the harm you are causing on tenants in New York City. With inflation still swallowing wages and wages declining, with all of the indicators of poverty showing that New Yorkers and low-income New Yorkers are in dire straits, this board still thinks that rent increases are necessary so landlords can supposedly improve the quality of rent-stabilized buildings, despite their neglecting those buildings for decades. The board continues to tell us that if we don't increase rents X amount % per year in and year out, what will happen when the rent-stabilized housing stock truly deteriorates and bottoms out? What are you going to say when we need a double-digit rent increase on tenants to save rent-stabilized buildings? The response is threefold. Why should tenants even have to bear the burden at all, let alone in the form of a rent increase? Landlords and lobbyists would be better off spending their millions of dollars and energy pushing for expansions of subsidy programs or finding other ways to get money for expenses and capital improvements instead of fighting against good cause and ill-advised legal challenges that they continue to lose at the Supreme Court. They won't do that, though, because what this is really about is not just lessening operating expenses and getting money for maintenance, it's about maximizing value and profit for real estate developers and owners. Secondly, if we follow this board's logic and decision-making and increase rents on tenants year in and year out for fear that the building quality will decrease, again, this centers the actual apartments and buildings and the owner's business decisions over the tenants that rent stabilization law was intended to protect. There will be no low-income or working-class long-term rent-stabilized tenants and tenants of color that are able to live in rent-stabilized apartments if this board and this administration keep doing this. That is not speculation. The data from the Housing Vacancy Survey in 2023 from HPD shows exactly that. The number of newer rent-stabilized tenants in the last 2 years that have moved into rent-stabilized apartments are overwhelmingly more affluent and contain less non-white people in them. Our decision-making in the last few years and this year cannot be characterized as anything other than an attack on poor people of color, and working-class folks in favor of maintaining and increasing landlord stability and profit. The byproduct will be a completely different demographic of tenants that can afford significantly higher rents, which is precisely what landlords and their lobbyists want. Lastly, what does a 2, 3, 4, 5% rent increase on tenants really do for a landlord who needs to fix the quality of a rent-stabilized building anyways? Even setting aside this distress was in many cases caused as a result of landlord greed, risky business decisions, and neglect. The revenue generated by these increases don't cover much of the deferred maintenance that they've put off at all. Not to mention, there is still no proof that landlords actually use the increases given by RGB to try and fix their buildings. This administration and this board cannot hide behind data points to deflect from the truth, that they are okay with causing harm to low-income New Yorkers, people of color, long-term tenants, and the elderly. There can no longer be any doubt about whether this board or the administration actually care what happens to the fabric of our communities, our neighbors, our ancestors, our city. They do not. At the very beginning of the RGB process this year, the administration put out a statement saying the following, and I quote, "I keep talking about these small property landowners and everyone is dismissive of them, but they are hurting in this city and no one seems to understand how much the impact on tenants have impacted them," Adam said. Because if somebody's not paying their rent, then property landowners can't pay their mortgages, can't pay for their heat, can't pay for their housing. We need to be very conscious of them because of the wealth of black and brown people. That wealth lies in their property. Rent stabilization has always served more people of color than market rate apartments. In 2023 alone, 71% of the rent-stabilized households were headed by people of color. Despite the massive displacement of black New Yorkers in the last 2 decades due to gentrification and unaffordability, thank you Rent Guidelines Board increases, black New Yorkers still comprise 23% of the rent-stabilized housing stock. What message are you sending to black and brown New Yorkers when this administration and this board are calling for a third increase in 3 years that will likely total about 10% or more? These are the largest increases in almost a decade, and we're supposed to accept that this administration cares for communities of color? What message are you sending to low-income and working-class people and people of color when you are actively promoting and advocating for rent hikes at their expense to help the super minority of rent-stabilized owners? What will help black and brown New Yorkers isn't an additional rent increase on 1 million households and 3 million people, the majority of which are black and brown and are struggling to pay their rent, have a roof over their heads, and put food on the table. What would help them is finally implementing city FEPs, adequately funding the Human Rights Commission to help protect low-income New Yorkers from discrimination, ending over-policing and police misconduct, which accounts for $500 million since 2018, which could be used on public benefits, education, and housing, restoring the $400 million in budget cuts to early childhood education, and calling for a rent rollback or a freeze. In closing, despite my complete and utter disappointment in this administration and the board, I still had planned to propose a range for this vote, which would have included a rental adjustment range of a -2% rollback to 0 on a 1-year lease and a -2% to a 0% on a 2-year lease for both apartments and SROs. Instead, I've decided that the only vote we'll be making tonight is one of no confidence in this mayor and in this board.
We will continue then. I will resume the voting on our hotel motion. We have a yes from Doug Apple. Hennis Sisekino will take as an abstention. Christina DeRose? Yes. Rob Ehrlich? No. No? Okay. Arpit Gupta?
Yes.
Alex Schwartz?
Yes.
Christina Smith?
No.
Adon Solchen I'll take as an abstention, and I will vote yes. The vote passes by a vote of 5 to 2 and 2 abstentions. We will now consider motions for proposed apartment and loft order number 56. Before we do, I want to remind the public that these are preliminary guidelines. I encourage the public to participate in our annual process of public comment, and we look forward to reading and listening to your comments as we proceed. Traditionally, we trade off between tenant members and owner members. This year, it would have been the tenants' opportunity to move first, but they have declined to do so. So I will recognize Rob and Christina if they have a motion on the apartment order.
We do.
Please.
First of all, we'd like to thank our fellow board members who take this responsibility very seriously, who have advocated well on behalf of tenants, owners, and the public. Also, a special thank you to Andrew, Brian, Danielle, and Charmaine, who make our collective jobs easier. This proposal is based on hard data compiled by RGB staff that shows rent-stabilized buildings in the outer boroughs are in economic distress. Last year, this board adopted a final adjustment that was 5% below the inflation-adjusted commensurate on a one-year lease, and more than 10% below that commensurate on a two-year lease. Decisions have consequences, and we're seeing them play out in real time. In 2022, NOI is down for every pre-1974 rent-stabilized building outside core Manhattan. In the Bronx and Upper Manhattan, operating income has declined 20% in only 3 years. Distressed properties increased for the sixth straight year. Bank failures have occurred in large part due to their exposure to rent-stabilized buildings coming under massive stress as rising expenses cannot be met with current revenues. We cannot let this trend continue. We cannot let rent-stabilized housing return to where it was in the 1980s and early 90s. The distress in those decades did not happen overnight, and signs of percolating distress that we are seeing in this year's report harkens back to those times.
The board is charged with ensuring the pre-1974 rent-stabilized building housing stock has enough funding to be properly maintained and meet expenses, as well as balancing these needs with the needs of tenants who occupy said buildings. We urge this board to continue to make tenants aware of the programs which are designed to make sure no tenant is left behind, from SCREE and DREE to city agencies which have funding readily available to fill these needs. The housing safety net must continue to be a key aspect of the functioning housing ecosystem. But as in any ecosystem, distress in any one area will filter through and cause damage elsewhere. In our stabilized ecosystem, revenue growth is needed to overcome the underfunding relative to expense growth. Our proposal begins this process. Our proposal is focused on the needs of buildings in the Bronx, Queens, Central Brooklyn, and Northern Manhattan, so that those tenants can continue to live in properly maintained buildings. Housing has ever increased costs, and revenues need to meet those costs, especially in stabilized buildings. We believe our proposal strikes a fair balance and takes much needed steps to stop deterioration of affordable housing in most neighborhoods. To summarize, in accordance with my motion, you are voting on the adjustments proposed and the proposed language of the order. At this time, I would like to put forward a motion for proposed rental adjustments for rent-stabilized apartments and lofts. I move to adopt the language of the proposed apartment and loft order 56, and I move to adopt the following proposed rental adjustments for rent-stabilized apartments and lofts. Apartments, 1 year, 6% to 8%, 2 year, 9% to 11%. Lofts, 1 year increase, 0, 2 year increase, 0. Special guideline and decontrolled units, 27%. To summarize, in accordance with my motion, you are voting on the adjustments we propose and the proposed language of the order.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Any discussion? So 6 to 8 and 9 to 11. I will now take a vote. Doug Apple,
No.
Ennis Aquino, abstention. Christina DeRose,
No.
Rob Ehrlich,
Yes.
Arpit Gupta,
No.
Alex Schwartz,
No.
Christina Smith,
Yes.
Adon Soltran, abstention, and Nestor Davidson as chair will vote no. The motion does not pass on a vote of 5 to 2 with 2 abstentions. At this time, I would like to put forward a motion for proposed rental adjustments for rent-stabilized apartments and lofts. Before I do, just so I want to remind the members of the board and the public that these are our preliminary guidelines and encourage the members of the public to participate in our annual process of public comment. I move to adopt the language of proposed apartment and loft order number 56, and I move to adopt the following proposed rental adjustments for rent-stabilized apartments and lofts. For apartments, 1-year lease, a range of 2 to 4.5%. For a 2-year lease, a range of 4 to 6.5%. For lofts, a 1-year increase period, a range of 2 to 4.5%. A 2-year increase period in a range of 4 to 6.5%. For special guidelined and decontrolled units, 27% above the maximum base rent. To summarize, in accordance with my motion, you are voting on the adjustments I proposed and the proposed language of the order. Do I have a second?
Second.
Arpit Gupta, seconds. Any discussion? I will now take the vote. Doug Apple?
Yes.
Ennis Aquino, abstention. Christina DeRose?
Yes.
Rob Ehrlich?
No.
Arpit Gupta?
Yes.
Alex Schwartz?
Yes.
Christina Smith?
No.
Adon Soltran, I'll take that as an abstention. And Nestor Davidson as chair, I vote yes. The motion passes by a vote of 5 to 2 with 2 abstentions. There being no further matters, do I have a motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Second?
Second.